Will please help me welcome Veronica Brown.
Okay. Thanks for coming out this morning. I'm here to share more of my favorite houses. As Kim said, I did the first season. I did a presentation called My Favorite Houses, and then since then I've gotten some new ones, and so none of these are duplicates. These are all brand new houses, and these are local houses because we're going to do a couple Leamington houses that are very interesting. So I want to share with you that I've been researching Kingsville houses and buildings for over 20 years now. And there are different reasons why I research houses. Sometimes I investigate houses when people come to the Kingsville archives, where I'm a volunteer, and because they moved into a new house or they want to know where the family farm is, and then I will look into properties for people like that. And then others times, as I'm driving around, an interesting house will kind of catch my eye. And once in a while, I stumble across an old picture that piques my interest, and I try to hunt down the location. Next slide. And this is one of those instances. I was researching a totally different topic. I was looking up some stuff in the Windsor Star and online archives, and I came across this article from the Windsor Star dated the 29th of April, 1922, with the headline, "The Oldest Inhabited House in Essex." Of course, that got my attention. I'm going to read to you below. The article reads, back in the early 80s, that would be the 1880s, when homes were hewn from the virgin forest, Thomas Dawson erected the house shown in the above picture at what is now the corner of Talbot Road and the 4th Concession in Gosfield North. The stones were collected from the fields of the homestead, and the roof was formed from saplings he cut with his own hand. The house has stood and been continually occupied since 1842. So first things first, I had to find out if this house was still standing, because a lot of these older homes are no longer with us. And it is. And it's right on Union Avenue in Ruthven. But it wasn't built in 1842, like it said. The following information comes from a book published in 1905, so this is an earlier reference, more accurate. And it says, as a child, Thomas Dawson came with his family from England and settled in Romney Township. In 1836, when he turned 21, Thomas and his brother walked to Port Talbot to apply for land in Romney Township from Colonel Talbot, which they were given. Keep in mind, they walked there, and the distance would have been about 120 kilometers one way. And I guess their dad couldn't, give up a horse, maybe? I don't know. So they got this other property in Romney Township, but then in 1849, Thomas sold his interest in the property to his brother, and he moved to Gosfield Township. He bought 100 acres from Christopher Weigel. At the time, the farm was wild, only 5 acres of it having been cultivated. But a log house had been built upon it, and into this the family moved. And he made it their home until 1852, when Thomas erected this stone cottage. So it's actually from 1852. This information lines up with other research I conducted using property records and everything. I always try to double check everything. So here is an earlier photo of the house that the Kingsville Archives has in their collection, and it shows the original house before the extension was added. And I must say, they did a great job. You would never know that was an extension. Whoever the stonemason was, they did a fabulous job. So now I have to tell you a little bit more about Dawson, because he seemed like a very interesting guy. And this is an article from 1902, just a few months before he was turning 90 years old. And he was a property owner, so they referred to him as Squire, which a large property owner sometimes got that nickname. So Squire Dawson was born in England in 1813, and when 3 years of age, crossed the ocean with his parents. The passage required 6 months and 3 days. Can you imagine how many times a toddler asked, "Are we there yet?" in 6 months? So it's reported that, according to Thomas, the vessel was swamped when land was in sight, but all the passengers were picked up and landed safely on shore. In his younger days, Mr. Dawson was a great hunter. He was fond of roaming through the woods where Ruthven now stands and encountered all kinds of wild beasts. Some of his stories of hairbreadth escapes from bears and wildcats are quite thrilling. In his prime, the squire was also an uncommonly good wrestler. He boasts that he never met a man who could put him on his back, and he was very fond of athletics and frequently cleared 44 feet in a hop, step, and a jump. So, when you're 90 years old, you can say whatever you like about yourself, right? Squire Dawson is a proud progenitor of 60 grandchildren and 33 great-grandchildren. The death of his wife 3 years ago was a sad blow to him, as they had lived happily for over 60 years together. 12 years blessed their union. Imagine raising 12 children in this house. Different days. Oh, sorry. So the Dawson stone house got me thinking of other stone houses that we have here in Kingsville. Anyone recognize this house? Yeah. Hey. So it's on County Road 20 near Adams Golden Acres Motel, which is west of town. So this is a great old photo that, again, is in the archives, Kingsville Archives collection. All right. So to let you know that it was built in 1858 by Jasper and Christine Golden, and again, it's on County Road 20. So Jasper Golden was born in Ireland and emigrated to Canada in 1850, which only took 5 weeks, as opposed to Dawson's 24 weeks. So that's the big difference with transatlantic, when the steam engines kind of came in for the boats. He was a trained school teacher who taught in the Amherstburg area for a couple of years until taking a position in the Kingsville area here. He married Christine Malott in 1857 and decided to give up teaching, and he started farming full-time on part of his father-in-law's farm. So this was Malott property that he was able to build this stone house on. So according to Jasper Golden's diary, building commenced on July 14, 1858. The walls were constructed of the field stones that had been collected by Mr. Golden. It is recorded in a 1977 article that the walls were 8 inches thick and were secured by lime and sand. No cement was used at all. Some very large rocks can be seen in the walls, particularly in the corners. And those rocks came from Kingston and had been used as ship's ballast when Golden's brother-in-law, Captain William Malott, who sailed between Kingston and Kingsville with cargoes of grain. So he would bring these, unload these, and were put into the house back in the 1850s. 4 years later, Jasper and Christine were given 85 acres by Christine's father for $1, and that's where this property, this house is on. And the brother, Captain Malott, was given the other 115 acres. By the way, Jasper Golden died in 1916 at the age of 93. Now, Dawson lived till he was 90, so I'm wondering, does living in a stone house give you a longer life? Someone needs to do a study on that. And here's another stone house on the same road, but east of town. People recognize this home? Yes. Great. So it's on Seacliff Drive, built between 1851 and 1860. It's unclear the exact date, by George and Mary Fox. The construction date is approximate because early records are scarce. Here in Kingsville, we didn't even have, we didn't have any fire codes until the 1890s, and that was just for uptown as far as building went. And you didn't even have to apply for a permit until the 1920s. So that's why a lot of these dates of construction, you really have to dive down and see if you can find oral history or very specific records. And some of the early records, what I used for this one is the 1850 assessment roll, because it actually lists what the house looked like. And in 1850, George and Mary were living in a frame house that was under 2 stories. Now, the next kind of jumping off point to describe houses is the 1861 census. So there's like a 11-year gap there. But it does show the Foxes living in a 1.5-story house constructed of stone. So that's how I'm able to determine it's sometime between 1851 and 1860. Now here is a picture of that same house from the Windsor Star from 1977. And according to this article, it says, Fox was clearing his 100-acre farm and used the fieldstone for the exterior, and he constructed the walls so that they average about 2 feet thick. The interior was lathed and plastered, mainly to insulate the home rather than any aesthetic purpose. With the two earlier stone houses being only one story, I'm kind of leaning towards this one being a little bit later, probably closer to 1960, because it is a story and a half. The earlier picture, you couldn't see that it had the second story, but this side one definitely shows you the two windows up top. George died in 1901 at the age of 75, but Mary lived till 87, so my theory's looking good. Their son Charles and his wife Lucinda were next to live in the house. Charles Fox was engaged in farming and lumbering, and he was also the reeve of Gosfield South for over 20 years. But he died at 59 and Mary lived till 67, so my theory's looking a little shaky. So we're going to keep heading down towards Seacliff into Leamington for a couple houses because they're really interesting. People recognize this house? Of course. So this is the Captain Darius Nelson and Mary Malott house, built around 1862. So oral history says that this house was built in 1848 by Captain Darius Nelson Malott, but my research was a little bit more exacting than that. So Captain Nelson Malott and his wife purchased 100 acres in 1859 in this location, where the house is now. The 1861 census lists Nelson Malott, who was a master mariner, and his wife as living in a one-story plank house. So that was kind of the early, the first house they put on their farm. Now, Captain Nelson Malott died in 1864. So the oral history is always that he built it. So we have to kind of assume that the house, or the middle part anyways, because the wings would have been a later addition, was probably built about 1862. There are many interesting stories about Captain Malott, one being his involvement with a schooner ramming and sinking a steamer in Lake Michigan. And it turned out to be one of the most horrific tragedies in the Great Lakes history.
Veronica, can I ask a question?
Of course, yes.
When you say to me, okay, I know Seacliff, he got 100 acres.
Yes.
I can't picture that. Would that go from Seacliff all the way to the lake? I don't know what 100 acres looks like.
Yeah, you know what, and afterwards, no problem. Afterwards, I have maps that can kind of show you. So yeah, so basically it's when the surveys were done in the 1790s, sometimes as late as 1803, and they would, that actual lot would go from the lake all the way up. So, and there were usually 200-acre lots, really. So he would have only bought half a farm lot because all farm lots were around 200 acres. So afterwards, come up, I can show you some maps to kind of give you a visual.
I'm going to just ask we keep questions to the end because nobody can hear the questions on the video, so then they just hear her answer a little bit.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so here's a picture of that steamer that was sunk, and this was the Lady Elgin. And this is a picture the day before she was lost. So this was an engraving taken from a photo. So this is the story. Malott was the master of the schooner Augusta, and on the 8th of September 1860, the Augusta rammed and sank the steamer Lady Elgin during a gale, which resulted in the deaths of over 300 people. Malott was actually arrested and tried in Chicago, because this was on Lake Michigan, but he was found not guilty of navigational negligence for the incident. And there's an interesting painting, from the Winnetka Historical Society. So to give you a little bit more context, the not guilty judgment was based on a law that not only gave sail the right over steam, but did not require sailing vessels to carry running lights. So, if you're out on the water, if you were a vessel that used sails, you had right of way over a vessel that used steam power. So, if you learn one thing today, let it be known that when you're on the water, sail over steam. I think it's very important. And it didn't have the running lights. So apparently Augusta had sighted the passenger steamer 20 minutes before the collision, but in the rain had misjudged the distance between them. Now, so they kind of rammed into it, and you can see that the Augusta is quite smaller. And after the collision, Malott had communicated with the captain of the Lady Elgin, and he had asked, you know, do you need me to stay and help? Because it really looked like the Augusta was really more badly damaged. And the other captain said they were okay, and Malott sailed back to shore because he needed to get back to shore because of the damage. And so he didn't hear about the Lady Elgin and the sinking of the Lady Elgin until the next morning. And it was decided that 4 years after this disaster in 1864, because of this collision, a new ruling was made requiring sailing vessels to carry running lights at all times. And they said at the time, in the 1860s, on the Great Lakes, there was upwards of 1,700 vessels sailing the Great Lakes, and all of them in the dark with no lights up until 64. So they really felt like that was a contributing factor. Although cleared of charges in the deaths of over 300 passengers, Malott was not accepted by the public in either Milwaukee or Chicago. That was kind of where he ended up doing a lot of shipping, was in Lake Michigan. And I'm wondering if perhaps this is when he came to Leamington, because this is about the same time this house was built, or his house was built. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about another disaster that Captain Malott was part of. So in 1864, Captain Malott was named Master of the Mojave, a canaler or barkentine vessel that's similar to this vessel right here. So this is what it would have looked like. And these were specially made boats to go through the different canals. And so he was given, captaincy over it. And on the 23rd of June in 1864, the Mojave departed Milwaukee with a cargo of 19,500 bushels of wheat slated for Buffalo. And during the night, so the first night, the second night they're out, the 24th of June, Mojave, while sailing through a thick fog, grounded on a reef in northern Lake Michigan. And the next morning, wind and heavy seas from the southwest blew the ship further up onto the reef. And then the crew threw quantities of cargo overboard, so they threw all the wheat overboard trying to lighten the load, and it didn't help. They didn't get off the reef, and the Mojave went down in a trough of the waves and became swamped and sank very quickly. So at least 5 crew members died, including 30-year-old Captain Darius Nelson Malott, and the remains were not recovered, according to the Wisconsin Historical Society. In fact, the inscription on Malott's memorial marker in Lakeview Cemetery in Leamington, Ontario, reads, "Lost with the bark Mojave on Lake Michigan." So interestingly, in 2016, shipwreck hunter Stephen Radovan discovered the well-preserved Mojave 12.5 miles northwest of Sheboygan, Wisconsin. It's 12 miles from the Breakwater Lighthouse in Sheboygan. So this is actually photos of the Mojave that Nelson went down in. The ship is partially embedded in the lake bed, 295 feet below the surface. And the vessel, so could you imagine, so this is like 1864, and now it's just been found in 2016. The vessel, the society is quoted as, "The vessel is completely intact up to the main deck, and 2 of its 3 masts remain standing." So you can see that this is an actual photo, and then they went down and they took digital kind of, I don't know the exact vernacular for it, but digital readings to make this upper drawing composite. And so if you want to know more about this and see more photos, it's wisconsinshipwrecks.org. This is where I got the information from. And interestingly, the Mojave shipwreck was added to the National Register of Historic Places in the United States in June 2024. And so people actually, you are allowed to go down and scuba dive. They have many restrictions, but you are allowed to go down and scuba dive and look at the wreck. So 30 years old, he went down. So this is, again, the house that Darius Nelson Malott had built, and it remained in the Malott family until 1935. So we're going to keep going down further up the road in Leamington to look at this house. People recognize this house? Of course, landmark, right? So this is Peter and Matilda Conover House, and it was built in 1875. So in 1859, the Conover family purchased 170 acres along Lake Erie, and it was divided up into smaller lots. Peter Conover bought this lot in 1864. So Peter had been a carpenter prior to going into farming, and in fact, he actually helped build the Point Pelee Lighthouse in 1857. And then when he bought this property, he went into peach farming, and he must have made a pretty good go of it because he built this brick house in 1875. After his death in 1906, his son Forrest inherited the house, and he was appointed the lightkeeper of the Leamington Light Station. And you can know around this area there is a street called Forrest, and it was named after Forrest Conover. So in the 1890s, Peter Conover converted 20 acres of his farm into a park, which became so popular that the Michigan Central Railroad Company built a station calling it Sea Cliff Park. So he was bringing people in ostensibly to kind of buy his peaches, but it was bringing people in, and you can see in this map, you can see the railway, and it would have been a spur that came just down for the sole purpose of coming down to the lake, and it swings around into the park. So this was, he kind of leased it to the town for a while. Like he started this up himself, then he leased it to the town, and then after his death, Forrest ended up selling 15 acres to the town of Leamington in 1907 for $4,000, and that's Sea Cliff Park today. So that came from the Conover family. And if, you know, when you're driving around and you see that house, you'll see how it's just across the street from Sea Cliff Park. Just to go back to this home for a moment, and to give you guys an idea of when you're going around looking at old houses yourselves, the stone porch on this house is not original to the house. So this is something that happened in the 1920s to houses that were built in the 1880s, 1890s. So basically people want to update their houses. A lot of their verandas that were made of wood were kind of falling in. And so a lot of houses around here have these stone porches, these wraparound porches. And now that I've said that, you're going to see them everywhere. So they're they're not original to the house. They'd be the 1920s. And in fact, Forrest Conover built this, the stone veranda in 1922 because they were very fashionable at the time. And I do like the bell tower he added. That's very unique. So that's not original to the house. Now, this is an example of one of those houses that I would see while driving around town and would often wonder about. And so it's on Sea Cliff Drive. We're back in Kingsville now, at Kratz Side Road. And there's many a time when I was dropping off and picking up my kids from the skate park on Kratz Road that I'd be sitting at that intersection waiting for traffic to clear, and I would see this house. And so I got to wondering, and again, if something piqued my interest, I would go ahead and research it. So I was able to determine that this was built in 1892 for Deborah Scratch. She was the widow of, and I gotta love this name, Archimedes Scratch. Not enough babies are named Archimedes anymore. And he had died in 1890. And she never remarried, and she stayed in this home until her death in 1918. So I believe what happened was her husband had passed, and he was only in his 50s, but they had grown children, so the kids had kind of parceled up the property, and then built this house for her. She used the money from the sale of the property to build this house for her to live in. Now, this is an example of another older home, because this is 1892, that was renovated with the stone porch. So again, that stone porch would not be original to the house. And also this, interestingly, when it was updated in the 20s, the slanted roof lines, which are called clipped gables, are also from the 1920s. So she would have updated this with the roof lines. And if you see any houses around that kind of have those clipped gables on the front, good guess is it's either been renovated in the 1920s or built in the 1920s. Now, since Deborah Scratch lived near Kratz Side Road, now would be a good time to talk about the spelling change that happened to these two German names. As you see here, Scratch became Kratz, and Weigel became Weigel. I believe some people will pronounce it Wiegel if it was German, but later it talks about everyone just called it Weigel, even back early days. And I want to tell you how that happened. So, about the year 1800, there came to Gosfield a man named McMurray. By birth, he was Irish, and he had been in General Wayne's army, but he was American, came up here, and when he came in 1800, up to this time, such an institution as a schoolhouse or a school was unknown in the country. So shortly after him coming, he commenced a school. His education was limited, but sufficient to meet the immediate wants of the children. He taught for 52 years, and in that time, 4 generations. And this was his great pride. So the schoolmaster was the oracle in those days, as he was supposed to know more than anyone else, and consequently was authority on all subjects. Kind of sounds insufferable, but we'll go with it. It seems that he decidedly objected to the name of Kratz and insisted that the English of it was scratch and ought to be so spelled. In time, Leonard Scratch submitted to the change, and the name was changed from Kratz to Scratch, which name his descendants have ever since borne, although a few later ones did kind of change it back, hence the Kratz side road. This, in the estimation of many, was a great error committed. Likewise, the name of Weigel was changed to the present way of spelling it, Weigel, but that does not alter the pronunciation, and consequently, not so serious a change. Here's a random fact about McMurray. His wife, Sally, apparently drank the first tea that ever came to this part of Canada. Now, this is gossip from 1881, so take it for what it's worth. Leonard Scratch had obtained some of the tea at the enormous price of $5 per pound. And Leonard Scratch's wife had invited Mrs. McMurray to drink tea with her. She said she distinctly remembered that they did not like it as well as the herb that they had been using as a drink. So that's how we have the different spellings here. It's because of one man. And we're coming to one of my most favorite houses. And speaking of Weigels, here's an article that I came across that made me hunt down a house. So this is from 1876. It's from the New York Herald, which is published in Richmond Hill, but it is talking about an article from the Detroit News, and I'll read it to you. The Detroit News tells of a wealthy Canadian named Lemon Weigel. It turned out it was Simon Weigel, but it was written Lemon, belonging to the county of Essex, who had just had a divorce from his wife, Jane Weigel, granted in an American court. The testimony shows that they had separated 7 years ago while at Kingsville, Ontario. At the time of the separation, she retired to her room, and although Mr. Weigel was at home most of the time, they never saw each other but once in 4 years. She ate at the same table as the rest of the family, taking her meals after her husband had gone. When she left her rooms to go into the other part of the house, she always posted a sentinel, one of her kids, to keep a sharp lookout lest her husband, coming in unawares, might meet her. In short, she lived the life of a recluse. So when I was reading this article, I was like, oh my goodness, he must have been an awful, awful man. Then I read the rest of the article. Mr. Weigel was a wealthy farmer of high standing, and for his children's sake dreaded to take his trouble into the courts. Therefore, when his daughter, who had kept house for him since her mother began her hermit life, became married, he offered her $10,000 to take her mother to go live with her, but she refused to do it. $10,000 in 1876. I would take that now. So his son, who is a young physician, had to testify at this hearing, and he was offered the same amount to take his mother to live with him, but he testified before Commissioner Randall in Detroit that he would not do it for $35,000 in gold. So Mr. Weigel went to Detroit after the marriage of his daughter and has been engaged in the lumber mill. So she must have been something, to put it kindly. So why did Simon Weigel go to Detroit to get his divorce? Well, actually, I'll tell you that right now before we go into his settlement. So this is a law book, The Handy Guide to Laws of Ontario. So it talks about divorce. There are no divorce courts in Ontario. To obtain a divorce, it is necessary to have a private act passed by the Dominion Parliament. A divorce can only be got in consequence of adultery, and there is no distinction between the sexes in those provinces whose divorce proceedings are carried out by the Dominion Parliament. So basically, Ontario, each province had their own rules as far as divorce goes. So basically, Ontario didn't allow divorce. So you needed to go to your MP and ask for a private member's bill to go in front of the Canadian Parliament to be granted a divorce. But with the rule being that only had to be adultery, that's kind of embarrassing because this would be open to everyone. And you had to, probably have money to do this, and you had to really know someone that would present this for you. So what a lot of people in this area did was they just hopped over to Detroit, and they were granted divorces in Detroit. So it would be considered legal, but you could not get remarried in Ontario. And in fact, when Simon Weigel was granted his divorce, he did remarry, and he went to Quebec, and he was able to get married in Quebec. And there is talks about, it's surprising back in the 1870s, there's quite a few people that had hopped over and were granted divorce by Detroit courts over there. Now, before going to court for the divorce, like I said, the Simon guy sounds like an all right guy, because in December of 1875, so this is a few months before he went to Detroit to ask for the divorce, he made provisions for his wife by the way of a trustee, her brother Hiram McCain. So he gave her a life lease in trust for a house and 35 acres. The 35 acres were in Lot M, second concession west of Division. That's the technical description of it, but it is the northwest corner of Road 2 and Division Road North. So it's highlighted here that that's the 35 acres that she was given in trust to be trusteed over by her brother. And so basically that was a farm that she could rent out as an income. And then he also provided her with a house. He was in the process of building it. So in the deed, it talks about the building and completion of the said dwelling house and the delivery of the possession of the same to the said Jane Weigel. Plus, cause or procure to be paid, so this is all Simon responsible for this, all the taxes, rates, levies, charges, rents, assessments, statute, labor, and other impositions. So he took care of everything for that house to give to her. And also, starting January in 1876, $70 yearly as kind of an alimony. And after the death of Jane Weigel, every clause and covenant shall be absolutely null and void for all intents and purposes whatsoever. So it all went back to Simon. So this was just almost like her life lease on this. So she was able to have this house, get $70 cash, and then also rent out the farm for herself. You guys want to know which house in Kingsville this is? Because it's still standing. It's located on Division North. It's the Hillendale Bread and Breakfast. So this is the house Simon had built for Jane, where she lived until her death in 1893. So the interesting thing is not only did he do this, like he built her the house, he gave her the farm income, he also left Kingsville. Like he had lots of farms still in Kingsville. He had lumber dealings here. He lived in Essex for a while, and then he lived in Windsor for a while, and he really left her Kingsville. And it was after her death in 1893 that him and his new wife came back to Kingsville. He waited till she was gone to be able to come back to Kingsville, and seemed to be well respected. Simon Weigel had been raised by David Conklin, so he was well known in the area, and he was a very successful businessman. Must have been successful if he could offer $10,000 in 1876, or probably earlier than that when his daughter got married. And she never remarried, and the latest census that I'd seen for her from 1891, she was living alone in that house, but for one young boy that was a servant that I think was 11 years old that came from Ireland. So to get someone to live with her, she had to, get one in from Ireland. So it didn't sound like her family or her kids really spent a lot of time with her or whatever, and she did always refer to her as Mrs. Simon Weigel. And in fact, there is a story from 1888 that Simon had built a house on Division South as a rental property, or he built it to sell, and then he sold it to a retiring farmer. And when the farmer from Division North packed up all his stuff and went to go move into the house, she was in front of the house barring it, saying, "No, I'm Mrs. Simon Weigel. I did not sign off on this house, and you cannot get into this house." So she still was under the illusion that she was still married, and she still carried on in Kingsville. But so it sounds like Simon was a pretty stand-up guy, made allowances for his wife. And so I'm ending this presentation with this house, which is possibly the oldest divorce settlement still standing today, because it is 150 years old, this house. So these are some of
What was the word you used before settlement?
a divorce settlement.
Oh, divorce.
Yes.
Oh, okay, I thought it was like a surname. Okay.
Oh.
No, okay. Say, do you mind saying the sentence again?
Sure, absolutely. So it was possibly the oldest divorce settlement still standing because it's 150 years old, this house, and it was built as a divorce settlement.
That's Harry's house.
It's Harry's house.
That's Harry's house.
It's-
Oh,
it's Harry's house.
He should have come. He's having a nice walk, but you know what? I'm sure he'll I'll get you guys together because I'm not sure he knows all those details.
No problem. Absolutely. It's a fun story. Absolutely is a fun story. Because actually, I did another presentation. So Jane's surname, or her maiden name was McCain, of the McCain Side Road. And that's a whole nother presentation because those McCains were wacky. The wacky McCains. Yes. Yes, that's a whole nother story. I will say that McCain Side Road was named after her brother, William McCain, who was Essex County Councilor. I think it was the head of Essex County Council. And I will just say he was the white sheep of the family because the rest of them were all some very interesting stories. So, but for another time. But that's my story about some of my favorite houses locally.
Stay tuned for Wacky McCain in season 4.
Oh, the Wacky McCains.
We'll look for that in season 4.
That's a ride.
Thank you, Veronica. If you can join me in thanking Veronica for her presentation today.